So this week, we are advancing to section 7.6, Soul is Not Spirit, of essay 7, Soul and Spirit and Ego of the book Mythos and Logos by Kenneth Smith. And we're live streaming now, so we'll just dive into this. And part of what we're doing here is in this section, Kenneth is exploring the way that after reading Hegel and Kierkegaard and Aquinas and Augustine and others, he sort of attempted to come up with a definition of soul and spirit that aligns with Gnosis and Noesis. And it does so, taking into account Kierkegaard and Hegel's ideas that both of them start out in a primitive basal metabolic form that's finitized, turned back upon itself, in which it's not achieving its full potential. And they also occur in a infinitizing mature adult form that's far more sophisticated and complex. So as he talks about soul and spirit in this section, he's going to go back and forth between referring to them in their sort of finitized form and their more mature infinitized form. And that can make reading it tricky because you're constantly having to modulate which version of soul is he talking about, which version of spirit is he talking about. When he says that soul is passive, he's talking about the immersive quality of gnosis, the way that it will plug you into your feelings and experiences and memories and plug you into your sensations about the world so that you fit yourself into the larger whole. And that's the function of gnosis, is to give us that ability to become a finely tuned sense organ of the cosmos, using sort of Carl Sagan's ideas, in which the cosmos is looking at itself and is aware of itself and aware of its place. Whereas with Noesis, using Hegelian's concept of the negation, what's happening is that we are withdrawing and abstracting from that immersive, soulish, gnosic state in order to achieve greater freedom so that our will can act, so that we can make plans in abstracto based upon our analysis of the world rather than how it actually is. And so Noesis comes with this great bonus of power, this freight of power that it grants to us. But it also comes with all of this tragic potential, because as we lose touch with our feelings and our immersive place in the world, our plans can go further and further awry and become more and more elaborated until they seem like an artificial world itself. And we start to mistake the construct that we've built for the real world and confuse the two with each other. And so each of these forms each of these modalities in its finitized form has tragic potential, whether it's to too passively accept things that you ought to change, or to egregiously change things you ought to accept. There's an enormous problem that each of them has that's characteristic of that mode in its finitized state. And what we see in Hegel and Kierkegaard and in Smith's elaboration of this, where he merges it with kind of the Greek concept of character types, he argues that in its mature adult form, gnosis or soulishness unfolds into an infinitized form where it can harness that immersiveness and also harness the spiritedness of noesis and put them together into a full thing that he would call spirit, where you're able to be immersed in the world consciously rather than unconsciously. You're able to be immersed in it actively instead of passively, because you've found a way to bring together the strengths of noesis and the strengths of gnosis. So this is the challenge. As he talks about soul, as he talks about spirit, as he talks about ego, he's modulating between these different places within this framework. And we have to be, as we read it, sometimes we can read him literally. Sometimes he says precisely what he means to say. And sometimes it'll be off one notch, in the schema. And we have to correct and understand what he's trying to say. So that's sort of my opening comments on this to get us started. And of course we can dive right into the text. But one of the things that he's distinguishing that we've talked about in the last month or two, is this idea that Gnosis in its primitive finitized form is very soulish. And he's talking a lot about the passivity of it and the immersiveness of it, and that spirit is what happens when Gnosis is able to achieve its adult, mature form. When you're able to be not just immersed in the world, but also in movement, in transformation, in a way that doesn't abstract you from the world and negate your experience. So I know that's a lot to absorb, but let's dive in. If people have questions, comments, or concerns about the text or the way that it opens. You want me to go further?
Well, I think as we look towards Gnosis, about
Yes.
what is about how can that mature, and what does it mean, the sense of self in relationship to Gnosis, of that familiarity, that relationship, that
Yes.
aliveness.
Yes.
And I think of the tendency of the intellect in trying to pin things down, of making them dead.
Yes.
And how do we, I guess, that as a potential theme of their relationship,
Yes.
of and noticing that within ourselves, so that our sense of self, how we pin ourselves down, can have more potential dynamic freedom to relate. And I think then lies that sense of, there's an idiom that I think goes, whether it's fundamental or just of artificial, is that yourself is always bigger than what you think it is.
Right.
Is always more complex than what you think it is.
Right.
And that's, I would say, on all levels, there's a high fruitfulness to that meditation, and so that that sort of reductionist tendency to simplify everything into a basic model gets checked.
Yes.
And I think that is the most important aspect of this kind of study and reflection, is not to resort to the tendency for reduction or reductionism.
Right. Right. Yeah. To resist noesis's, when it's in its finitizing form, to resist the impulse to try to make everything fit on the Procrustean bed of the law of the excluded middle. Things either are or are not. They're either true or they're false. That categorizing and drawing strict lines and insisting that the world sort itself according to what makes us noetically comfortable, gets us into trouble. And as long as we keep a leash on our noesis and force it to serve instead of to be the master, force it to serve the reality that we find ourselves in, then we have a way to keep an eye on that tendency to oversimplify and to pin things down that's natural to noesis. We come back to Heraclitus's kind of two dicta, one talking about the fact that that nature is lawful and complex beyond human comprehension, not just the nature around us, but the nature within us. And as he says, the soul, the limits of the soul, the world inside of us, the nature inside of us is so complex that you could spend your whole lifetime trying to fathom its depths and you still wouldn't succeed. It's just as infinite inside as nature is outside. And so that should act as a check on the hubris of noesis, to say all of our models for ourselves, as well as our models for the world, have to be taken with a whole truckload of salt and a readiness to let new information make us restructure our models. And as long as we do that, you're right, then it can be a servant that really helps us. But that involves recognizing the infinitude of both of the twin natures, the nature outside and inside, requires uncoiling the finitized form of noesis, Verstand, to allow it to dilate to become Vernunft, to be able to accept that there are infinite things it can't, put the limits on, that it can't put into nice, tidy boxes, that the truth goes beyond the model. And once it does that, noesis starts to grow up and become an adult form of thinking. That's It starts to merge with Gnosis, because Gnosis can bring us the infantizing recognition of how sophisticated and complex the world is and our own characters. And when we bring that together with Noesis's desire to analyze and categorize and organize, then we start thinking in an adult way that Hegel talks about some, but mostly as not being the other two forms. There's a lot about Vernunft we'd like to know more about. We'd like to hear what is the living experience of doing this. And as Donald has talked about in earlier weeks, Kenneth Smith's response is always, well, in ancient Greece, they always said if you wanted to learn what an Aristos is, you shouldn't go to a class, you should go find an Aristos and watch them and hang out with them, because it's very hard to explain. It's very hard to put into words why this mode of thought is different from either Begriff or Verstand, but it is different. It's just once you've encountered it, you get the taste of it, and you realize it's despite the fact that it shares the genetics with Begriff and Verstand, despite the fact that it is based on it is a form of Gnosis, it is a form of Noesis, it is the things we've seen before. Nevertheless, the uncoiling out of the self-enclosing finitizing forms transforms it so dramatically that it's almost unrecognizable, like comparing the caterpillar to the butterfly. So Phil, go ahead, you got your hand up.
Yeah, when I read this, I actually thought of Plato's cave, myth of the cave.
Yes.
And I thought either it's upside down, incomplete. Because I thought of the fact that the guy that climbed up the cave and saw the sun,
Yeah.
that was incomplete, because the sun is, I guess, in some way rather blinding, and that he should, the real secret to that, the incompleteness, is the transit. He should be going up but back and up and back, and that transition between the outer light and the inner light is built together, and that in a sense, and then I thought of the metaphor of the fire, right? Prometheus gave man fire, and the fire was, in a sense, the inner light that has something to do with the outer light. And that relationship at the transition is in a sense, the awakening of the inner light that's able to connect to the outer light. I think Plato saw it as a pure act of liberation when you climb out of the cave and you suddenly saw the world as it is, supposedly.
Right.
But in some sense, it's really that transition between the two that knits it together, that allows it to, in a sense, have a completeness about at least our humanity in relationship to the world.
Yes.
So I thought that maybe I should be more generous and say that myth was incomplete rather than false.
Yes.
Because I think without the outer light, then it's also no good. But without the inner light, then in a sense, I guess the self is not motivated to move either. So I kind of think that I wish he had gone back. He did go back, but he told when he went back, he said, this whole thing is a lie. But in fact, he was not. He did not create a synthesis when he said this is a lie. Just go to the upper chamber, right? And so I think the knitting together itself is what creates a transformation of what we are into what we could be, into the potentiality of what we could be. And I think that's the point, is how you knit the two together. So that's a metaphor that I want to use. I still think the myth of the cave is a useful thing, but it was more one-directional rather than bi-directional feedback.
Yeah. It's
And
like a hammer.
Augustine made in a sense the same mistake. I mean, he sort of carried it one step further by, in a sense, the mind of God lights up the mind of man, but
Right.
he did really, I guess, argue that in fact the mind of man had the potentiality of being lit up, and so therefore is already connected to God to begin with. And so I think Augustine also made the mistake. And so I think, but Augustine was, I think, in some sense, maybe a more dynamic viewpoint of that. So there was a sympathy, but it was also one directional.
Yeah, we're gonna get more Augustine in the next book. When in Millennium Microcosm, the section on Christianity, he's going to bring up Augustine and Aquinas and spend some time with them, and that's really going to unpack some of this. And you can see how Augustine's philosophy is so driven by his rejection of the corruption of Rome and his frustration with the promise of the ancient world being betrayed by the corruption, the way that everything that it said it would do, it instead was delivering the rottenest forms. And that created a creative tension within him that made him come at the critique differently than the way Plato did. I mean, granted, Plato was furious over the execution of Socrates, but he thought that was something specific people or specific, institutions had done. He didn't think it was a criticism of the entire ancient ethos, the way that Augustine was, in fact, trying to criticize the entire ancient ethos. And so as a result, Augustine brings these nuances to it that Plato didn't bring. And Plato could fall prey to the law of the excluded middle and just say, well, there's just right and there's wrong. And if you're in the cave, you're wrong. And if you're out of the cave, you're right. And he should, as you say, he skipped over the transition because he was so focused on the specific situation.
Well, it also made me think about Prometheus too. I mean, he supposedly did at least a virtuous act in relationship to man, but he was punished. Maybe that's why the Greeks always live in this sort of tragic mode, right? In other words, you must suffer, and it doesn't explain why. I suppose he's supposed to obey the order of not giving fire, the inner light to mankind, right?
Yeah.
And he disobeyed it, and now he's messed everything up in terms of the superiority of the gods, and so therefore he has to suffer the consequences of disobeying, and so it throws it into a kind of a tragic worldview that you could never really get away with the inner light. So it's just interesting how with more information you have another dimension of unpacking the myths.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say that in Plato, maybe, the sun is not something we see. We can't look at it without going blind. The sun is what lets us see everything else. And it's used, I think, as an analogy to the good. The idea of the good is what lets us understand and see the other ideas. It's the source idea. It's not something that we look at and see, but it's something that lets us see and order other things. It's an organization kind of thing. Of course, while Phil and I may be close to the same age, it's clear we had pretty different Plato professors at some point. Neither one of them, though, was 2,500 years old, so we never got to talk. We never got to talk to the guy.
Right.
Well, the difference is I disagree with my professor.
Well, strangely, so did I. And I usually tell people that when I talk about Plato, that don't go offer my interpretations to anyone else, because I've never run into anyone that read it the same way that I did. And
Yeah.
I was wanting to say this last week to Sharon, but I don't think she's on this week.
No, she's missing this week.
Yeah, she was going hiking. When you say you've studied philosophy and then you present all this stuff from Kenneth Smith, if you're talking to academic philosophers, you're going to get some strange responses, because this is not the standard interpretation of Hegel, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Aristotle, anybody.
No.
It's Kenneth Smith's reading.
Yes.
So just be cautious. We're not learning the canon here, and and the traditional interpretations,
Right.
which probably wouldn't hurt to have studied them, but it may not have helped.
Right. Yeah.
It may just help you realize how different this is.
Yes. Yes. This is definitely an existentialist take, and not an abstract existentialist take, but the result of grappling specifically with specific philosophers and working on what the relationships between those philosophers was in order to synthesize a sort of a new existentialist perspective that's compatible with them, but that has things to say about the entire body of philosophy and politics and economics and everything else.
And I would say, since you mentioned existentialism, that the kind of soul and spirit that get mentioned here and are discussed here are things that appeared in history, and that had they not appeared without Jesus, this particular idea of spirit in Christianity would not have been known. Or perhaps it would have, maybe through the Buddha, it would have been known, this kind of thing. And as I made way too much of when we discussed the thing about Freud, when these experiences appear in human history, for Kenneth, it's, and we must make sense of this. We must begin to understand what are I forget what he called, the preconditions that make such an experience possible.
Right.
And now I'll say, I have no idea what Kenneth has found for the preconditions of spirituality. Go ahead.
All right, let's call on Peter. Go ahead. You got your hand up.
I think, especially when it comes down to classical Western education, there really is of that Platonic school that believes that the map is the territory, that by correctly having the nuanced interpretation and model of the universe, then that in of itself is the goal. And the confusion that comes with that as a product of mind, as an idol to worship, an object that you can then make your center of gravity and build your house, when really it's still ultimately just an idea. So how do we compare with Ken's idea of, the more foundation of the gnosis, of the experience, not the idea, and the real, how do you emphasize that in regards to the difference that an experience is not an idea? It can produce ideas, but it's there. And how do you look at that as the bedrock to truth, more than what you can distill, however, in a however purified a way, an understanding of the experience? I think that, yes, classical Western education really, especially with many of the Platonic schools that of come from Porphyry's line, really emphasize that intellectual purity as being relating to the heights of the noetic, where Ken is saying, no, it's through gnosis, through familiarity, through the living relationship, not from this endless of critiquing, molding, and redefining the right way of grasping it.
Yeah. Kenneth would be in I think largely in agreement with that. His focus is on, he's not trying to say that noesis is not important. He's trying to say that under modernism, we've deified noesis. We're infatuated with it, and we've criminalized gnosis. We call it the source of all chaos and badness, and we call it subjectivity and say, oh, it's just subjective. That's just your emotions. That's just your experience. What you should be paying attention to is the objective systematized schemas that we've developed through noesis. And so he's saying there's a massive imbalance in the way we look at the world. And it can sound like he's saying noesis is evil, and he's saying nothing of the sort. He's saying being so unbalanced that your understanding of the sacred ends up being noesis itself. That's evil. It leads to great evils. It's an enormous distortion. And so as a result, he finds himself always pushing the same direction, not because he wants us to overreach the other way, but to try to get us out of this far extremist position we've gotten into, to get back to a position of balance where we can understand the importance of gnosis, of experience, and what's underlying that push is the idea that of the two choices of normativity, nature and its laws versus human societies and the laws that we've made up, of the two, nature will always be more authoritative. We can vote that there's no climate change and it will happen anyway. We can vote that there's no sea level rise, and it doesn't matter. Louisiana is losing coastline anyway. It's like in the war between yourself and the world, back the world, says Kafka. And that's like the heart of the existentialist position, that you have to make sure that anything you're doing philosophically or politically or culturally is always grounded in the lawfulness of nature, not the lawfulness we say is in nature or that we perceive is in nature, but the lawfulness that's actually there. And the only way to get close to that is through approximation. We're going to err, we're going to get it wrong a lot, but we have to successively approximate, and we have to immerse ourselves in it in order to have a chance for it to correct the many, many, many mistakes in our models of it, and to try to change over time to get closer to it. And so you're right, he does have this focus on the experiential, the existential, the natural, in order to get at the lawfulness that we need to be aligning ourselves with in order to be a going concern. Go ahead, Peter.
I think of one sort of, this thought I'm about to explain isn't really as thought out, because it's still something I've been reflecting on for a while, of what is this type of what I would call dualism, this sense of these myths that we have that relate to this idea of father to son and forgetting the woman, all these patriarchal ways of, what is that law of nature of, when men and women combine, there's a third. What is of how we look at this yin yang thing, and how it breaks duality,
right,
by adding more greater dimension, that things do not boil down into opposites, but that they're always intertwined and they're always creating more. That it's I feel that it is that type of common reductionism of trying to find order versus chaos and making
Yes.
one good and the other bad.
Yes.
As opposed to no, opposites come together. It's not an endless war. They come together and create all the multitude. And I think that's the fundamental difference of what is that sort of, as looking at nature, of all the great diversity that comes out of it. That I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what are the pathways out of these intellectual dualisms,
Yes.
that keep people always of seeing things, trying to create sharp distinction, as opposed to looking at the spectrum and about how you can relate to the spectrum differently, and that produces different models of
Yes.
relationship.
Yes. Yeah, it's fascinating the way that when we embrace dualism too much, when we engage in the law of the excluded middle, that Noesis encourages us, rewards us for engaging in. When we overdo that, we end up with a black and white world, not in the sense of a grayscale devoid of color, but literally of black and white, in which one is all good and everything else is all evil, and there's nothing in between. It's remarkable when you think that, any of us who've seen images that have been reduced to literally black and white with no gray, and how warped and distorted they are. What's fascinating is that if you replace that with a complete rich grayscale, you gain so much more nuance and information, and yet you're still dealing with a colorless picture of reality. It's like, it would be an upgrade to move to a model of the world devoid of color from the black and white kind of dualism that we're trapped in. It would still be a massive improvement to move to grayscale, even though we could see at once the enormous amount of information that's missing from it, from the complete absence of color. And that's what happens with our minds when we over-engage in this dualism. We get to where we've warped things so much that it would be a massive improvement to rise to the level of a merely obvious warpage of reality. We've warped so far, we're losing our ability to see how warped we are. And everything starts to feel natural to us in our artifice. And this is how the trap of the self-enclosure of Verstand works, is that it redefines everything as pointing back to itself, and excludes any possibility of an other, let alone of a complex richness that dissolves the boundaries between us and the other. Now, I think about the way that, trying to make everything all good and nothing bad, trying to exclude the bad thing and destroy it and be left with only the good thing, is like trying to make a magnet that only has a positive pole. It's like you could chop that thing until kingdom come, and you are never going to get a magnetic monopole. And in fact, if you bring two magnets together, each of which has its own positive and negative field, when they come together, they form one larger, more sophisticated field. They don't destroy each other like antimatter. One of them is not the devil. Instead, you get this rich, complex thing. But when we become monomaniacal in our dualism, we sort of end up with this notion that evil must be destroyed and eliminated in order to solve all the world's problems. And we forget how warped that is. Nothing in nature works that way. The artifice is like stamped on the surface of us at all times in the things we say and do. If only we could step outside of our envelope and turn around and look at it and go, oh my God, where'd all the color go? Where'd all the gray go? Where'd all the richness go? Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder whether contemporary brain science might lead us out of this problem. Because it seems like, on the one hand, it almost seems like on one level, you could maybe call it a deep level, but maybe the deep level is not the true structure. There does seem to be a bipolarity of information on off, positive, negative charge.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me contemporary brain science is trying to tell us that is actually a foundational structure, not the real representation of the world, that the brain overcomes that by creating communication lines between various parts of the brain that allows you to see a whole in a different way than a reductionist on-off thing. And I'm thinking of Impressionism in this sense. What came after Impressionism was, for a short time, was what they call pointillism, which you could see as kind of like a micromanagement of Impressionism into a systematic structure.
Yes.
And I always saw that it was like a false form, in the sense of reducing it to the richer brushstrokes and the blending of color in a white way that you could experience it on a more a broader scale of the whole. And it seems to me the problem with the mind on one level is captured by a kind of understanding. I mean, I do understand that understanding wants to understand, right? But the problem with understanding is that it really divides it into a kind of black and white world. Oh, I understand this. No, this is good and that's not so good. You know, it's like then you divide this. And I think, once again, it's the transition between that and the other thing that actually produces the gray scale, as you would call it, you know, that in between us. And I think that we've been captured by the form so adamantly, it's hard to get out of it. And so we think of, okay, there's always new content that's coming up to us through experience. But the form will, in a sense, purify that in the sense of creating an understanding of what the structure is. I'm just thinking the experience of the world not only give you new insights and new content, but I think that necessarily we must allow it to also transform the forms themselves.
Yes.
And, you know, and in terms of contemporary model building, it seems to be something that's leading us partially out of that, because you're constructing a model, but you realize that this is a temporary structure. It's a model of what we know now in terms of creating a synthesis of all these possibilities. But it is a model, is not a true representation of the world. So I think maybe we're at a point after so many years, but in some sense, maybe in a way too late to say, oh, no, we're finally breaking the bonds of this sort of bipolar sort of dialectic between, you know, identity and difference, you know, just forget about the difference. And so I just wonder whether, in some sense, of course, there's a lot of science that is caught up still in this sort of other structure, but I think maybe we're finally being led out of that, maybe. And so, yeah, the mind still is going to be reductive in some sense, because it could never really produce a true representation of the world. But at least it shouldn't be so reductive that it excludes everything except the identity itself. So even if you build a circle of things, there is a more complexity that allows a representation to represent, rather than just like, this is true, that's false, you know. But we know that in the transition, that's not true. That's always sliding to some other truth in some sense. So I don't know. I think the mind itself is part of the problem. And I think now we have a better understanding that there's a more intimate relationship between appearances and realities than we gave it credit for.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, the modernist Verstand-oriented model of the mind as either objective or subjective really is a just childish oversimplification of what's actually a very difficult problem of epistemology, which is the claim that anything that could come out of a human mouth could be objective is a claim of godliness. It's a claim of divinity. It says, I am speaking the unvarnished, accurate truth. I may not be saying all the parts of it, but I'm saying the relevant, important parts of it, because I know the entire cosmos of information, so that I've been able to exclude the irrelevant parts, because I know which parts are relevant or not relevant, and that makes me objective. So there is an inherent claim to be God anytime someone postures themselves as, I'm the objective one, unlike you who's subjective, right? There's, again, law of the excluded middle. There's this very simple binary black and white dualism that goes on in modernism, where we're all competing for who gets to be the critic, who gets to be the objective one, who gets to be the grown-up, the professional, and everybody else therefore has to submit because they're less Verstand than we are. We've proven our superior Verstandness, and therefore we should rule. And it's it's a child's game, right? It's the sort of thing that you see elementary kids doing when they try to psych each other out. And yet we're doing it as adults under modernism because, as Kenneth Smith critiques us, we have flattened the possibilities of the human mind to keep ourselves crushed down into these two finitized forms of Begriff and Verstand, not allowing for the emergence of the more mature, more nuanced mind that could look at those kinds of reasoning and go, dear God, that's childish. No, you can't make a law system based on that. No, you can't make a political system based on, you can't do any of those things because it's too childish. You have to rise to a higher level of thinking if you want to be able to deal with the world well. And
that's why I really love that Beethoven quote. He says, music is one of the few doorways in which we could have access to true wisdom, and that wisdom that we can never understand totally, but wisdom understands us. Yes. And in some sense, it's sort of admitting that we're not gods, and our understanding is incomplete. That all we could really do, in a sense, is to harmonize us with this sort of more divine being, rather than claiming that we know it. And I think you could say, well, that's kind of in between position. and I actually don't think it is. I think it actually is a degree of humility, and you might even say piety, to humanity, rather than saying, I got the claim, I am the, if not the divine order, I'm at least the most closest. Of
that's
course,
right.
with Napoleon, that's why Beethoven throw up his dedication, right? He's like, no, you got
None
this
for
wrong.
You
went a bit far.
Monster. Yep. Peter, go ahead.
Let's see. I'm gonna try to figure out how to explain this. And this is one of my great projects in my life, is to figure out how to explain what I'm gonna try to explain.
Oh my goodness.
I suppose this as this question of relevance, right? That sense of what is the motivation? What is one trying to achieve in any of this? And the whole of making that as an assumption that's almost beyond question. Like, what is the search for security, stability, beauty, power, maturity, rest, organization in our looking towards what we call truth? And what I think it's easy to really make all the conversation and focus to be about the impersonal, objective, or global, and really move everything, to always find a way to move away from the individual, the personal, and the immediate. This of always trying to figure out what is the correct shape I can conform my thoughts to, rather than, well, what shape are they in now? What are they in on a deeper level? It's less about discovery and more about going from wrong to right. It is that narrative that keeps on making all these conversations always about that moves away from the personal, that one's individual feelings, as opposed to one's conclusions and current model, becomes something as of not a matter of course, not important. That it's not about what's actually deep within us, but about what we value of what we've produced from it. And I think that there's that that natural aversion, that natural repulsion from going into the personal, going into the powerful. I think that it's so easy for, in these intellectual discussions the world over, to constantly go into this of high abstraction, so that the more visceral states of what we literally are experiencing are that's playing with the mud.
Right.
You don't want to do that.
Right.
And
because
I
we've
think
scapegoated that.
it's an artificial detachment. I think it's important to look at this of the context of any type of philosophical discussion and how that naturally becomes this sort of base level of distinction. You don't want to reveal what isn't pretty, reveal what isn't refined.
Right.
And so the crude then gets ignored.
Right.
And when really that's where the meat is, the experience,
Right.
not simply the abstraction that you've been working on as a pet project.
Right. And you know, what's interesting is that even though Nietzsche in the later stages of his career made it so much clearer that he valued that side of life, the Dionysian, as he called it, the you know, the parts, the unexamined part of life, you know, containing the meat and the juice that makes life worth living. And we think, well, that is a very Nietzschean thing to do, to embrace the irrational and the unconscious and the personal and emotional. It's actually all there in Hegel too. Hegel just did it in such a odd way that it's easy to read Hegel and not understanding that he's savaging Verstand. He's saying, yeah, Begriff is limited. It's too parochial and too personal, sure. But he says Verstand has the opposite problem. It's so impersonal, it's not real. It's a fake artifice of negation. And that the only truth that can be found is to bring the personal and impersonal together into a new synthetic form, you know, the Vernunft, in which we can engage in our rational mind while simultaneously being immersed in the experience of life. And so in a way, kind of the dancing chaos of Nietzsche at his most celebratory is hiding in Hegel. I mean, and it's not hiding like Hegel forgot to say it, but Hegel said it in such a rationalist way that it's easy to read it as a rationalist manifesto, when in fact he's more or less giving a manifesto for the importance of the personal and the subjective and the experiential as being an inescapable part of the whole truth that we're trying to approach. So I'm, you know, what you're talking about, Peter, is all over this. This is deep in the existentialist tradition that Kenneth Smith is drawing off of. Stephen, go ahead.
Oh yeah, since we're getting close to the birth of tragedy.
Yes.
Why were the Greeks pessimistic? Now this is where Nietzsche, one of the things where Nietzsche landed in hot water with academia is he said the Greeks were pessimistic, and yes, as far as academia was concerned, the dawn of the Greeks was it. That was the golden moment. Yes. That was, and Nietzsche's saying, they really weren't all that happy. They were a bit pessimistic, you know. And yeah, now the thing with Nietzsche, all right, it's a nutcase. We know that. Sure. But as David's favourite academic pointed out, yes, he was a nutcase, but he had a tremendous tool of a mind. And he was instantly seeing things that most people don't see.
Yes.
Even though on the other hand, he had enormous personal problems.
Yes.
He had this fantastic tool of a mind. So this fantastic tool said, you guys don't get it. The Greeks were pessimistic.
Yes.
And I think he put that there as a lure. He was testing people with it.
Yeah.
Here's a riddle. Why were the Greeks pessimistic, as the Sphinx said to Oedipus?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Generations of academics are repeating the myth of the Sphinx, the riddle of the Sphinx, as though it were just as simple as it's taught to us when we're little kids. And here along comes Nietzsche going, how can all of you be just not even seeing what's underlying this? It's so much deeper than it seems on the surface. This is about so much more. Oh yeah, there it is. Thank you, Peter. It's about so much more than just, you know, can you come up with an answer to a tricky question? It's about this deeper pessimism and this question of the human existence. And of course, you know, once you see the whole context that Nietzsche wants to give you, you can see why he thinks the Greeks would be pessimistic. I mean, classical Greek civilization is being born out of a dark age that followed a heroic age. And that the thing that destroyed the heroic age was not some kind of bad guy somewhere else in the world who came along and stole it from them. It's not some devil or Satan. The heroes themselves destroyed their own age through their virtues. This is like the foundation of classical Greek civilization is, wow, even the very best of us who had divine blood flowing in their veins screwed up so badly that they wrecked everything for 1,000 years. And now what chance do we have? How are we going to do better than that? It's like it's like the opening sentence of a massive epic as laying out before you this possibility of catastrophe, the certainty of past catastrophe, and the immediate and pressing danger of new catastrophe, or even worse, not a new catastrophe, but returning to the old one and doing it all over again while having your eyes open the whole time, trying desperately not to do it, but doing it anyway. This is like, you can see why the Greeks would be pessimistic. And of course, the thing that just does not get taught enough by the academics is this horrible, tragic truth that the thing they were most afraid of is exactly what they did next. They rose up fast. They did everything in their power to do the right thing, and they ended up tearing apart their own civilization, just like their forebears had done, just like every single Greek person had been brought up to say, absolutely don't do that. This is the one thing you shouldn't do. And they did it. And they're like, why can't we stop ourselves? What is wrong with us? I picked up this. Go ahead,
The Greeks
Stephen.
didn't tear apart their civilization until after Alexander. It was the 2nd century BC when the decline set in.
Well, sure. But I mean, I think of that as the second decline, right? Because first you had the Peloponnesian War, Athens versus Sparta. You had Thebes involved after that. You had Corinth involved after that. They ripped themselves to pieces and made themselves weak, which is why it was so easy for the Macedonians to conquer.
Oh yeah, sorry. It's the question of which Greeks. I keep on making the mistake of including the Macedonians.
Right. So so you've got the Hellenic and then the Hellenistic, and they rise back up again. You're right, under Alexander, and then they have, I guess we have to call it a third self-immolation, in which Hellenistic civilization finally undid itself too. So they were trapped in this cycle of self-rising and then self-destruction. They 3 times we have documented that they did it.
I keep on making the point, and everyone's missing this. And I think this is really the one that Nietzsche was laying out. And it's simple. It's horribly simple. And yet they all missed it, that Greece at the time was, the civilized world was sort of ending with Greece as far as Europe goes. There was, some of the cultures going past Greece were civilized. The Greeks would tell you they weren't, but in a sense that grander sense of culture and civilization was something that was throughout the Middle East. And Greece was the farthest outpost of that grandiose sort of sense of culture. But most of it had been taken over by this huge black panther called the Persian Empire.
Right.
You got to think you're a Greek. You've got your slaves doing all the work for you. You're running around the middle of the city with the theatre and the temples and chatting philosophy, and you're having a pretty good time. So much so that it hurts. But, you're looking across the horizon at the sea, and you know that all along that horizon, the Persians are coming.
Right. And
even though they defeated the Persians a couple of times, that fear was there from, the middle of the 6th century until Alexander squashed them, that there was always that potential that the Persians were coming. So, it's fantastic. We're all dancing around, but there's this big black foot that could any time come down on you and squash you.
Yeah.
And to me, this is this is this external aspect. It was this external aspect which was probably the greatest cause of Greek pessimism, which drove the tragedians. We see exactly a similar thing with England, Tudor England, where you've got the beautiful period of tragedian plays. At the very same time, there was a huge Spanish Habsburg Empire which was determined to snuff out that small light of independence and freedom.
Right.
And yeah, it's a parallel. It's a fascinating parallel, and there are other parallels as well.
Yeah.
But at that moment, this particular culture will engage in tragic drama, as Nietzsche pointed out, as a catharsis of what was going on around them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That sets us up really well for the text, because the way that this paragraph opens in 7.6, he's talking about the nature of Christianity. He's talking about the nature of the religion, and he's relating it to soul and ego and spirit. And he's doing it in order to talk about Christianity in a precise way that's very different from the way we're normally allowed to talk about Christianity. Because Christianity is the dominant religion in Europe and in the Americas, we are strongly discouraged from talking about it clearly. And because Christianity has enormous internal divisions, it's also very hard to talk about Christianity clearly, because if you say almost anything about it, some branch of Christianity will say, well, we're Christians and we don't do that, so that's not Christianity. So you say, oh, okay, well then you attempt to describe Christianity as that branch, and some other branch comes forward and says, no, we're Christians and we don't do that, so that's not Christianity either. So we're left with this paradox in which it's the unspeakable religion, in which it's all things and no things, and you're not allowed to say anything clear about it. The discussions get murky. And the one thing that happens is if someone comes along who's not a Christian and attempts to describe Christianity, then all the branches unite and say, no, you don't have the right to say who we are. We define ourselves, so go away. But the way we define ourselves is all different from each other. And some of our value systems are precisely the opposite of others. And some of them are the opposite of Jesus's value system, but you still can't tell us it's wrong. So there is this problem where the major dominant force really in a religious life of Europe and multiple continents, you're not allowed to speak clearly about, or else you get all this massive pushback. So what you're seeing here in 7.6 is a continuation of a tradition that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others have engaged in, where they say, well, that's all nice. You all can call yourselves whatever you want, but we need to be able to talk about you because you exist in the real world. You are an actual phenomena of culture and history. And as an actual phenomena of culture and history, you're important. We have to be able to understand you, not just in your own terms, but also in terms of how have you affected history? Why did you rise? Where did your divisions come from, and so forth? And so in this, he is talking about the relationship between soul and spirit and ego. Although he doesn't use the word ego, it's all over the first 3 or 4 sentences, where he's talking about the way that the Christian church split itself in the medieval epoch into a great number of people who passively accepted it, who had a soulish experience of Christianity, and a smaller number of people who took over the political structure of the church and used it to rule. And how many of them were not soulish at all, but they were very ego driven. They were very will driven. They were very Verstand. To use Hegel's terminology, you've got an enormous mass of Begriff people who are being ruled over by a structure that's very Verstand, that's very analytical about how to rule. Where are there going to be, different levels of the church? Where are there going to be different officers that have different levels of authority? How are we going to spread from one country to the next? What are we going to do about these outbreaks of heresies? There's an enormous amount of planning and thinking and systematizing that's going on in a very Verstand way. And that Verstand level of Christianity was part of it, and an inescapable part of it in the medieval epoch, in the same way that the great mass of people who are having a more dualic the Griff soulish experience of Christianity were also part of it. And it's hard to talk about this because officially, formally, everybody in Christianity are all brothers and at the same level. But actually in Europe, what we saw is a hierarchy. And it wasn't just an arbitrary hierarchy or a continuum, but a real difference of character types between who tended to be left at the bottom and who tended to rise to the top in the positions of power and manipulation. And even though we're not supposed to talk about it, you can't understand the medieval epoch if you don't talk about it. It doesn't actually come into focus without that. And all of that carries through the modernist revolution. It gets changed into a new form, a modernized form that still has a lot of the momentum of that 1,000-year structure, but which has been recast through modernist lenses. So we'll this is sort of a way to get started in talking about it. We'll go into detail in a moment, but Peter, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
When it comes down to the problem of any type of generalization and any type of argument, you make a generalization and then you critique it. There's always going to be legitimate issue with that, because it is, and to make any type of globalist argument of any kind, you're going to have to deal with a straw man. I mean, that's just a reality.
Right.
And why it's an informal fallacy instead of a direct fallacy is
Right.
because it's not inherently wrong. It's just fraught with
Yes.
issues, because that's just what you're going to have to do.
Yes.
I mean, any type of generalization you make is going to be illegitimate, at least in one way. And so, but in order to talk about nearly anything, you have to make a generalization based on what seems reasonable to you in regards to what something is, generally, if not specifically.
Yes.
And so this idea of not allowed, what I'm referring is that when you say not allowed without legitimate criticism, because anything you make, but that's, I think, the point of making any kind of argument is to get people talking about it.
Right.
Not necessarily to speak only pure truth about a thing, but about
Right.
to set up parameters so that people can then discuss about the merit of having set those parameters for the sake of the argument.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Peter. That's well said. There's one of the things that happens under modernism is that we've deified the concept of the individual, and really torn apart the idea of a community or a whole. And one of the ways that manifests is that there is a modernist dogma that every individual is self-defining, that our will is so godlike that we reinvent ourselves in a protean way from one moment to the next. And anybody who attempts to characterize us is committing a sin, because they're attempting to hem us in, whereas we are infinitely godlike free. We may be somebody completely different tomorrow than we were today, and that it's our right as moderns, our inexorable, inescapable right to redefine ourselves from one second to the next. So that in a way, it becomes this obscurantist, kind of cognitively defeating definition of the self as infinitely free, so infinitely free it can't be known. And it's one of the ways that Christianity was refracted through the modernist revolution, is it incorporated that into its definition of itself. And it's part of the reason why you get pushback not only in the form of legitimate criticism, which is legit, but you also get you also get illegitimate criticism that's in the form of, how dare you violate my godlike protean right to define myself from one second to the next however I want. You don't get to say who I am. Even if you're accurate, you don't get to say it, because that would be impinging upon my freedom to be whatever I want. There is this kind of weird pushback against the whole project of trying to understand it in anything but, if you want to just define it in the most endlessly flattering terms, then usually they'll go along with that. But if you try to do an analytical critique and say, well, here's its structures and how it's put together and why it arose in history the way that it did, that's when all the pushback comes, because it's like, well, you're violating my modernist freedom to be everything at the same time and nothing, and don't pin me down. One of the ways that Kenneth Smith summarizes this insistence on the infinite protean nature of the individual under modernism, it's his self-identification of himself as being full of infinities, is nolo me tangere. He quotes that line from, I can't remember, is it John, where Jesus says, "Don't touch me. I'm a being of the spirit now. I can't actually." Maybe it's not John. Maybe it's a different one, a different gospel. I can't be touched, and that's how moderns are about being defined. They're like, no, don't. It's part of why we hate shrinks. don't send me to a head shrink. I don't want anybody starting to say, well, your father had exactly the same problems you have. Is it possible that you're carrying on a generation? No, I'm free. I'm infinite. Don't touch me. You leave my mind alone. There's this kind of squeamishness about being defined. Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, this viewpoint that you've just described, strangely, often gets called existential. That human
Yes.
beings, that one creates one's essence by acting and choosing and willing.
Yes.
And being able to do this infinitely is even better than being able to do it finitely.
Yes.
So caution, you people that pay attention to Kenneth Smith and his existential approach,
Yes.
will run into existentialists that are, I don't know, banausic
Yes.
manipulators or whatever.
Yes.
The bad existentialist.
Yes. The claims to infinity form of existentialist rather than the recognition of the finiteness of our choices.
Well, I think I'm not a real existentialist, well read, but I think you see this some in Sartre and things like that we do get to create ourselves anew from
Yes.
ex nihilo.
Yes. Ex nihilo. Yes, infinities and abysses, whenever they start to become, part of the definition of the actual human experience, one suspects we're veering off into Verstand, which is ironic because Verstand's problem is that it's finitizing, but it does it through claims of infinity. So the idea that freedom could be not something we get to claim for ourselves, however we feel like having it, but could be an actual attribute, a lawful attribute of our character, subject to constraints in the same way that all true things, all real things are subject to constraints. There is a form that calls itself existentialist that does not care to admit that. It wants freedom to be all or nothing. We're either infinitely free or we have no freedom at all. And the idea that no, we're trapped somewhere in between is not appealing to that particular brand of existentialists.
Yeah, I think it's from Hegel that Kenneth gets this historicism, or I don't know the proper philosophical term, but that we always begin at a place in time in history. We
Yes.
never begin outside of history. We are never without preconditions.
Right.
And the idea is, through our efforts to win or achieve our freedom, given that, not wiping it out and saying, "Oh, how dare you? Presumptuous. Aren't you presumptuous? How dare you?"
How dare you claim that I have a history?
Yeah,
How dare you
right.
claim I'm a finite mortal being?
Right.
You're offending my ego.
Yeah, but well, I think that makes the point.
Yeah.
But it's just people that read Kenneth or study Kenneth, be aware there are a lot of other existential, so-called existentialists around.
Yeah, it's the problem we run into, right? It's one of the things that Kenneth points us right out of the gate, which is that the tools of language and thought that we have for understanding the world have already been warped before we even got started. And the warpage is the greatest on the things that matter the most. So anything you want to talk about that's important, pretty much all the tools we bring to bear on it are designed to prevent us from seeing it the way it actually is and to encourage us to see it the way our culture wants us to see it. So we're fighting against ourselves and our language at every turn. You can't, there's like no safe ground in the English language we can stand upon, like a term like existentialist, without finding that somebody else has defined it as the opposite of what it should be used for, or what needs to be said, shall we say. Peter, go ahead. You got your hand up.
There's another thing that I'm going to try to explain that I'm going to fail miserably at, but I'll try anyway.
Yeah, please.
To me, it is that sense of just your phrasing of not allowed to. It's because I think it's incomplete, because it's not without a particular consequence is what you really mean. Something would happen that you don't want to happen, which is perhaps infamy, being disliked. And that's why I see all of this language centered around we, an appeal to majority or appeal to utopia through changing the majority.
Right.
It's all about this real collectivist backdrop that sets of this morality and how we digest this data and these ideas is what we do in relationship to succeeding in the populace.
Yes.
As opposed to what does it mean to look at the limitations of what we self-impose through our language and ideas, and how much that actually goes towards our own personal morality on what is worth doing or not. And I mean, the whole that we all of course feel the pressure of what it means to conform. Everyone does in different ways. We're all tied up in different knots, that limit even what we allowed ourselves to think, let alone to feel, let alone to do. And I think that's less a problem of society and more a problem of the individual, because we don't need society to change to untie those knots individually. And I think that those two ideas are conflated often enough that, society's not letting me do this. Well, no, they just will punish you if you do. That's different. That's a completely different paradigm. And so it is that risk of thinking, feeling, and acting in accordance with your own personal belief outside of the passive model, that we grew up with in regards to what other people want of us. Right. And I think it's what's important the most is to break apart this generalization of what's normal. I mean, not to say that that's not there isn't wonders to make those generalizations about what the normal normally someone would like you to do or not to do, for example. Yes. It's important to have that, but it's also important to break that apart, so that you're able to then look at as a reflection of your own self-imposed limitations, to separate that from, I'm not a child anymore. I don't need to necessarily be imposed. There's no parental figure at this time. We're adults. We get to self-impose. Yeah, society will impose too. Our neighbors will impose. They'll do things if we do things they don't like, without a doubt. And we have to decide what is worth doing, right? What is our own internal sense of what, I don't want to say right and wrong necessarily, but as we weigh things internally, how can we more separate ourselves from the cliche of these I don't know, at the very least, semantical barriers, because I think that's how they manifest the most, and how we have these passive relationship to the paradigms that we feel bound by because of society accepts them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Peter. Phil and then Stephen.
Yeah, I'm actually quite troubled by this circle in this sense. Like, if soul is passive, but soul somehow understands that the nature of existence is tragic, and therefore it is passive in a slumber of accepting that in a sense. I wonder if the calculus is correct at number one to begin with, that it should change to being active in the sense of it being another hypnotized delusion that things are going to change. And so you better just keep quiet, stick to yourself, and not activate the spirit to change the world, because there's always been a hierarchical structure that takes over. But on the other hand, it seems to me like in order for spirit to penetrate to the passive nature of the soul, it seems to me that it needs to have an understanding, have to have a degree of understanding of how the history of the world is, and how it could, the activation of spirit could, in a sense, change the world. And I wonder whether the problem there is not ego. It seems to me in the past, in history, I think few possess, I guess, a kind of this sort of ego necessary to project itself in an existential world. And therefore, the rest remains mere obedience to what the structure is. But if you were going to activate it, in a sense, I wonder if that doesn't happen in the sense that it just being recaptured, or being, in a sense, a passive soul that is just sort of just becomes the army of those that have ego enough to struggle for change. And if that's the case, it seems to me, because I kind of wonder, for instance, the Christian right, like they're kind of activated now. I mean, I think they were more or less passive in politics, in changing the world, to the calling of activating your spirit in the world. But in a way, when they're activated, it seems to me you actually, in a sense, also remain a follower of those that have ego to project themselves in the world. And I wonder whether, if one does not have the, how should I say, the intellect to distinguish between the leaderships, the different leadership, and how it connects to you, then in a sense you could easily be recruited by the army of the negative to be motivated.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of think that it just seems like, it just seems important that the passive, soul has to somehow be broader in its understanding of the relationship between, in a sense, spirit and soul, and have that connection before you could actually motivate the army for change. And I just wonder whether that doesn't become more complicated in a world that's always been dominated by the forces that seems to be more self-serving. So I'm kind of troubled by that, because almost everybody in the modern world, now actually do understand ego to a certain degree, right? But the ego that's not connected to the sort of more nuanced understanding of what the manifest world really is, at least in terms of civilization. So that's a question I have, and it might have been easier. I hate saying this because I'm more or less, at least, somewhat of an equalitarian. It might have been easier to, in a sense, have a more limited struggle rather than activating and mobilizing the once egoless individual into this act, because the power always end up maintaining its control over power and could probably activate the ego in some way better than the ones that have, in some sense, less connection to the passive nature of the soul. And that's what I wonder. Of course, spirit's important because, I mean, in theory, everybody does have, in a sense, the capacity to activate the spirit in the correct way. I just wonder whether in a context that had always been the dominant power in the external world of civilization that controls the structure, whether one could actually succeed in doing so. I mean, this is that, I guess this is the problem I have. And now everybody is armed to the teeth and mobilized. But I wonder whether they have an understanding of what that mobilization truly is.
Certainly not. I mean, or put another way, they have their own understanding of it from that one limited perspective that they think encompasses all truth. It's the modernist flaw, right? We fall in love with our Verstand perspective and think that it's universal and complete, and that therefore we know enough. You know, the Verstand is always impatient to act because exercising the will is its natural idiom. So it will always find a reason why it's time to stop. It's time to stop trying to understand and time to act, legislate, impose, coerce.
Yeah.
This relationship between Gnosis and Noesis, between Begriff and Verstand, between the soul and the will, this is going to take a lot of unpacking. I mean, of course, because part of it is we have to be able to see it in the Hegelian sense in which it's meant, in which the will rises from soul naturally in us, like the way the blossom unfolds from the bud. Mm-hmm. It is not a sufficient existence to be entirely immersive and experiential. We run into the problems with it all over the place. And those problems create conflicts within us that drive us to develop our will so that we can start to plan and make decisions to avoid what we see as the problems with the immersive existence that we had before. So it's natural, as what Hegel calls the negation of the soulish mode of life arises in us naturally, almost from the day we're born, maybe before that, for all we know. None of us remember what that experience was like, but certainly you can see an infant struggling with the limitations of the experiential life. What if your parent isn't there quite quickly enough with food, or to change a diaper, or to doesn't quite know what it is that you want, and so you begin to be dissatisfied and you begin to struggle against it. And in the same way, I think it's telling. People talk a lot about the negation of the negation. If you look at articles on Hegelian synthesis, you'll see the negation of the negation is brought up all the time as his explanation of how synthesis works. But of course, what he's talking about is that just as the purely soulish existence is too limiting and we struggle to fight free from it, even while we are simultaneously trying to live that way, in the same way, the mode that we develop out of that, the will-based mode, overly egocentric mode, is also dissatisfying and creates enormous problems for ourselves, so that we're pressing against that too. And what began as a negation itself also has to be negated as we struggle free from its limitations. And in struggling free from its limitations, part of what we're doing is we're comparing it to what we gave up and finding that we may have thrown out the baby with the bathwater and that we need to reclaim some territory that was lost. But
my thought when you said that is like, isn't that the reductive language? I mean, not only in terms of the system as a whole, but in terms of, let's say, existing in media now to sound bites, it's more difficult to understand the nuance that's within it, because now everything is reduced to a sound bite. Yes. So everything is equivalent to everything else, right? What you're trying to say subtly, it's got to say it in 15 words. It's the same as what the other guy had to say in 15
but that's
words.
Just your opinion, man.
So I think it almost seems like it requires to have a sophisticated dialogue. You have to understand the nuance, at least within that. Even that is limited, but at least is more sophisticated. And I just wonder, waking up the soul with just sound bites doesn't add to the confusion of how they are waking up.
Yes, exactly. So you're starting to sketch out some of the labyrinth that we've trapped ourselves in. Yeah. It's so easy to take what should be these potentially infinitizing capacities of the mind, these faculties, and turn them back on themselves so that they re-enclose themselves, and we end up muddied, muddled, and trapped again. And that's the gridlock we talk about in politics, is the external working out of the same confusion that's happening in our own minds, where each administration undoes what the previous administration did until effectively we're not getting anywhere, doing anything with any sense of endurance. Stephen, and then Peter.
I was going to bringing up the points of Christian internal sort of morality. Have come across this strange term all of my time in reference to the Orients, where in the Orient they say face, whereas in the Occidental world, and possibly the Christian world's an extension of this, that the idea is very much of the internal right and wrong of things, that the internal responsibility for good and evil, contrasted against this famous, and I'm not saying I fully understand the dichotomy here, but it does seem to be a dichotomy that contrasted against the famous Oriental tendency of saving face, that the only thing that matters is the appearance. I do tend to notice in our Western politics today that old Occidental standard seems to be declining. We have a political class which is far more intensely about saving face than being straightforward and honest as in the past.
Yeah, this was also at the heart of Luther's critique of the corruption of the church, right? He was saying that they were too focused on appearing virtuous without actually being virtuous. So it's a problem, what you're talking about, the tendency to slip into focusing on appearances and social rewards and punishments rather than the internal struggle to do the right thing. This is a long-standing problem in Europe just as much as it is in Asia, I think. And I read, what you're bringing up, I read it a lot in critiques that compare Asian and European approaches to things, but the more I study in depth about European philosophy and history, and the more I study in depth about Asian European history, the more exceptions I find to the rule, until the point where I'm not sure whether it's just a generalization. To what extent is this idea that the Occidental world cares about actual morality, whereas the East only cares about appearances? To what extent is that the Western world caring about appearances and positioning itself as the one that appears to be virtuous?
Well, in the particularly the Roman Christianity, we have an extreme case, and that's the idea of the fall, and original sin. That
Right.
from the word go in Roman Christianity,
Right.
you are at fault. It's
Right.
your fault that the world has fallen.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying I fully understand all the issues here. That's not the point, but I see that there is a point here.
Yeah.
And he's making a reference to this point in this passage.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're right. There's some rich theology that he's mining here, and he's doing it so quickly that we really have to go over it a number of times to squeeze out everything that's in here. You're right, Stephen. Thank you. Peter, go ahead.
I suppose I wanted to, why the mention of the word ego?
Yeah.
I think that ego is one of the most convoluted terms we have in modern times, of where it can mean anything and everything, in regards to individualism of any kind.
Yeah.
And I think, because it doesn't have an exact form, it can just be an ambiguous sense of. I mean, the thing is that the word Freud came in regards to the model of its relationship to the superego and the id. And
Yes.
yet everyone keeps on just taking that little piece out and putting it in their system as if it has some inherent meaning outside of it.
Right.
I mean, yeah, you can when it comes to the say the ego being the central hub of identification within your sense of self. The ideas, metaphors of beliefs that make up more the core of what you value and see yourself as. I mean, I think that's fair and fine in of itself, but I think it's this idea of that it is intrinsically exists. I think, so much of the language we have and the arguments we make it out to be something that, as if it is already it's innate, as opposed to a contrast and viewpoint in relationship to the two others within the Freudian system, of which his system, has profound limitations as a model of itself. So when we take his limited model and then take a little piece of it and then put it into all these other different models, it never leads to clarity, because it's meant as this fucking boogeyman,
Right.
of being conceited, of being self-absorbed.
Right.
And I think therein lies that sense of, what is the morality of individualism as an idea, and how one relates to that of the profound subjectivity. Because I think, it's right that almost all of our systems, society systems, discourage you from going deep within yourself, because that is selfish. So therein lies why we stay on these shallow levels, the intellectual levels, because intellect deals with the common symbols that we use to communicate with each other. So what it means to move away from that, there's so many passive and in the dark biases that keep us from these profound states of introversion, because it's associated with being self-absorbed and thus bad.
Right.
Ego is one of the great barriers that many of the common writers since Freud have taken up that terminology in order to keep people more absorbed in the social reflection rather than the personal.
Yeah, that's right. All this language is fraught. It's the thing that we run into is every term that we might possibly turn to help us try to bring into focus the basal metabolism of the human mind and how that works itself out in character and culture and societies and history. All of those terms have been yanked into the least revelatory definitions possible. The popular culture, anything that makes them uncomfortable becomes a product of jokes. It turns into insults. It turns into it starts to be equated with other things that are more comfortable but less insightful, and eventually everything turns into a mush of money, sex, poop, and a handful of other things. It's like, how many synonyms for having sex are there in English? And is there any English sentence that you can make for which there's no tone of voice someone could possibly bring to it to turn it into an innuendo for sex? And, you know, it's the same way with money. You know, there's an enormous number of synonyms for money. And so these things have this erosive quality and warping quality on the language and the structures of our thought. And the more difficult and uncomfortable something is that we need to be able to say, the quicker it will be warped down into something that no longer means that. It's a problem. So when it comes to ego, id, ego, and superego, you know, on the one hand, sure, that's Freud's invention, but on the other hand, he borrowed it from Shakespeare, who got it from the Romans and the Greeks. And so it is a modernistic updating of an ancient model of the human mind that corresponds roughly to Douloi, Benausoi, and Aristoi, to Begriff, Verstand, Vernunft, you know, with a different spin, with a different focus, with his steam engine model of the mind, you know, replacing earlier models. But nevertheless, he's trying to capture the dialectics in a sort of semi-static, noetic way. So our problem is any words that we use to try to talk about this structure are going to be distractions and problems, which is why we end up foregrounding the problem of how do we even say these things. And we have to say out of the outset that we're not saying what these words mean for all time and for everyone, and we're not saying what they mean most of the time for most people. We just need to get some terminology together to be able to communicate with each other clearly. So when it comes to will / ego / Verstand / negation / abstraction / reason, intellect, systematization, noesis, there's this whole complex of different but subtly related terms that are attempting to talk about one of the two basal faculties of the human mind and how it works itself out in us. And that's the meaning in which we're using will and ego in this sense. It's the I choose, I decide, I dare. And, you know, Kenneth Smith's line on it is that it's a sword. And, you know, you can, or a knife. You can use it to cut vegetables, or you can use it to stab somebody. Or stab yourself. It is neither good nor bad, but it is definitely what it is. And what it is will change. The more you use the tool, the more everything will seem to be the sort of problem that can be solved with the tool. Just like the other basal faculty of the mind does the same thing from a different perspective. So we need to be able to talk clearly about what they are using language that isn't clear at all. This is the problem we find ourselves in. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I have to kind of defend interiority in this sense, and it really relates back to the inner light versus the outer light.
Yeah.
I remember when I was young, I hated Christmas, not because I hate Christmas, but because of the external effects. Because I was very poor and got nothing of any value, so to speak,
Right.
either to myself or to expose to others of anything. Yeah. I hated the couple days, maybe 3 days after Christmas when you go back to school, and everybody is, of course, anxious to tell you what they got for Christmas, how wonderful it was, and I had nothing to say, right? Because, and I just wish that conversation would go away, because it made me feel shame.
Yeah.
I never felt guilt, because I know that it wasn't caused by me, okay? And so that's a difference between a shame culture and a guilt culture. A guilt culture internalize what is right and wrong. So there's an inner light that tells you what is right and wrong. And that requires a certain amount of external experience as well as amount of sophistication of putting it together.
Yes.
And it's interesting to think, and I think we have to keep a close eye on Japan. Japan has, for many years, at least through the Edo period has developed a shame culture that was very, very pronounced, which means not only saving face, but fitting within the group,
Right.
so that you're protected and not and defended. So there was the reward in terms of developing shame because you exclude others and all that. Now, Japan after World War II certainly, but now is moving into a global culture and is suffering from that shame culture because it's about exclusion of others. That's why like the Japanese don't like other people in general, but it has to face that reality of how it's going to deal with it. And as that shame goes away, does the transfer become an internalized understanding of oneself in terms of feeling guilt? Because it was really external. In other words, other people make you feel shameful, and so therefore you avoid doing certain things. And so Japan is facing that, but so is the West, and particularly America, in which we put it, I guess, in a different way. We have the thing where we actually believe, fake it until you make it, right? In other words, you're not really living a reality. You're projecting a reality maybe that you want to be, and you fake it. And because everybody's faking it, that's okay. And therefore, in a sense, you are not living an authentic life. You don't not have a sort of like, how should I say, a internal light, because you only want to get it to the point where you actually are making it because it's accepted by the externalities. Right. And I think developing an inner light on some level is very important. Once again, you have to go back and forth the cave, because you can't just sort of like, I guess you could, some people would argue, just sit there and meditate, and finally you become one with the divine, and therefore you have this holiness of all. But my thought is there's always a traverse that takes place as you develop more and more, I guess, the inner light to guide yourself, so you're not as motivated. We're still motivated to a certain degree by shame. I mean, even myself, that's why I hated school, because even though I knew there was nothing that I did wrong during Christmas whatsoever, nonetheless, I felt shame. I never felt guilt, as I said. Right. And I think once you understand that distinction, I think you have now a greater understanding of how you could be driven by the spirit to express something that's internal, that's actually real and authentic, rather than be motivated to external sources such as making money. But in the meantime, you're a damn bad artist, but you're going to fake it until you make it, right? And particularly in a culture that actually is losing grip of understanding things in a deep way, you don't have to fake it that far before somebody say, like, we want you, we want you, we want you. I mean, I think in both cases, I think those two things in transition, the Japanese culture and the American culture, utilizing that exteriority and interiority in different ways, it's an interesting thing to watch, how America will finally come back to a degree of authenticity, a degree of more related to reality rather than fake it until you make it, and the degree that the Japanese could move more and more out of the shame culture into more internalized guilt culture when you really have done something wrong, right? Because the Japanese, like they're willing to die for, well, what somebody externally told you, right? And the Americans, they didn't want to die. They didn't want to die. So that's my thought about that. And I really do want to defend the importance of developing the interiority.
Thank you, Phil. So, with the remaining hour plus, let's take a stab at this text and see if with all of what we talked about now, can we start to see some of what he's talking about and some of what he means? And can we wrestle with some of the more difficult to express parts of it? So, what he's setting up in the first sentence when he says, but alas, for nearly everything that is conventionally called and mistaken for Christianity, soul is not spirit. Spirit may be the defining and central principle of Christianity, but soul is the pathos that all simple and peasant or proletarian personalities have in common with one another, all over the planet, all throughout history, whether during Christianity's reign or before or after it. So he's setting up this contrast between soul and spirit. And, for us, we could think of that as a contrast between Begriff and Vernunft, perhaps. We might think of it as Doulos and Aristos, perhaps. When he talks about spirit, is he talking about it strictly in an eristic Vernunft way, or is he trying to capture some of Gnosis in it? It's hard to say at this point. We don't have enough to go on. But he's made some bold claims. And one of them is, when he says soul is not spirit, and he says it's alas for things that call themselves Christianity but aren't, what he's getting into here is the murkiness and self-contradiction of the definitions of soul and spirit that get passed around in pop culture. The average person in the modern world doesn't know what they mean by soul or spirit. Or if they do know what they mean, it isn't at all what their neighbor means by soul or spirit. We have a bunch of, sort of parochial, self-contradictory, idiosyncratic, and frequently not at all clear or precise or in focus definitions. They mean the cool, mysterious part. Sometimes they mean the undying, immortal part. Sometimes they mean the magical part full of goodness. Now, there's a lot of arm waving that goes on around here. And the distinctions between soul and spirit are just as murky as the definitions of the things themselves. Now, it is often the case that specific sects within Christianity will have more precise definitions of what they mean by soul and spirit, but they frequently contradict what other sects mean by it. And so, part of what he's trying to set up here in this opening phrase, in this opening clause before the colon, is he's saying, there is a fundamental problem that has to be addressed, which is, what on earth are we talking about with these things? And he's saying, we're not going to be able to go to any kind of established standard that all Christians believe, because they don't all believe the same thing. And any person who walks up to you and tells you, I can tell you what soul and spirit are, is almost certainly not going to be making sense within their own terms, but also wouldn't make sense if you put them together with 3 or 4 other people who would all turn out to have different definitions. So this is what he's trying to lay out. He's saying we've got a problem, and the problem is being able to talk about 2 things that are actually incredibly important to understanding human character and nature, but we're just incompetent at being clear about these things that are so important to us. This is what he's setting up in the opening clause. He's saying, we've got to learn how to talk about these things, and we're not going to get a lot of help, or we'll get too much of the wrong kinds of help from current established definitions of these things. So he's going to take a stab at offering a definition that isn't his own idiosyncratic definition, but is drawn from a very long tradition, picking off of Aquinas and Augustine and Hegel and Kierkegaard and all these others. He's going to try to draw off that tradition to come up with a crisp definition of soul and spirit and how they relate to human character and history. And he's, as with anything that Smith does with terminology and perspectives, the underlying assumption is not that he's right and everybody else is wrong, but that we need more than one perspective. It would be nice if some of those perspectives would bring into focus the things we need to bring into focus. And he's going to offer a perspective that is one way to bring soul and spirit into focus. And, this is not a totalitarian evangelical project. This is here is one way to talk about these things. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was bringing up the that case back in the Dark Ages where the Roman Church more or less excluded the spirit from man. And that was they had a convention with the Eastern Church, and the Eastern Church never sort of went through with this idea. But I recall years ago I was sitting in a circle where this particular question was being discussed. Most of the audience was unaware of the historical circumstance, and the guy was discussing it said, well, he agreed with the church. The church had the position that we don't really understand what the idea of a spirit in man is, so we're going to exclude it. Now, the church defines human beings as obviously a body and a soul, and the key characteristic they gave the soul, guess what that was?
What is it?
Oh, rationality, reason.
Of course it is.
And there's this whole document, and they were what they were trying to ban was what they felt was the evil doctrine of there being two souls, and it seems the second soul was the spirit.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful document. Read the whole thing and how they define what a human being is. That key characteristic of the soul being reason. So the spirit is mysterious.
Yes.
The trichon, how do you ever say it? Trichotropy of man was something that was posited in the Hermetic doctrine, which had become very much the basis of all the mysticism, even the Christian mysticism at the time. So this is so we have body, and we have above nature and above the animal body, we have reason, which is something the animals don't rise to, but there's an aspect beyond that. That's the question.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. Yes. It's these are definitions we've struggled with, and it hasn't helped that we've had powerful institutions imposing definitions and saying to think anything else might get you burned at the stake, or at least a schism. If there's enough of you, we'll split from you. There's been a lot of, shall we say, very heated discussion about what these things are supposed to be and what you're supposed to think they are. And what's interesting when you if you spend a lot of time reading theological works of the Middle Ages, looking at the attempts to define some of these things, it's interesting how often the conclusions they arrived at were politically motivated, were the result of, if we define this way, our church will end up splitting and we'll lose half of our congregants. So we have to define it, but if we define it the way we like, or if we define it the way they like, then we'll all leave. So we actually have to define it this third way that links these things together in a way that neither of us feels like we should split the church over this. This happens over and over. You see this with the definition of the Trinity and what is the nature of God and man within Jesus. An enormous amount of fighting happened about the precise language that was allowed to be used. And if you were off even a little bit, you were a whole separate sect and you were shoved away. And people would ban you and say that you had the unacceptable definition of the relationship of the divine and the human within Jesus. So we're walking in a big minefield here, in which almost every conceivable alternative definition has been laid down by somebody with great force, and also objected to and absolutely repelled by others with equally great force. But Kenneth Smith, he likes a logic bomb, so in we go. There's no helping it. We're gonna get to it. So right after the colon is the clause, is one of the critical clauses. He commits the cardinal sin that you're not allowed to commit under modernism, of claiming to define Christianity. He says spirit may be the defining and central principle of Christianity. Spirit may be the central and defining characteristic of Christianity, central principle of Christianity. And to understand that, we need a lot of other Kenneth Smith writings, as well as usual, a whole body of other writings to make sense out of this. But part of what he's talked about elsewhere that brings this into focus is that In the ancient world, the gods were not different. They were sort of different in kind from human beings because they represented principles of nature, but they were not infinitely different because they were also part of nature, just like we are. And so there was a continuum of possibilities between the human and the divine. You saw people walking the earth and getting married, and you saw divinities walking the earth and getting married and having children, and you saw people who could apotheosize and become deities, or could become somewhere in between, demi-deities, or the great golden age heroes of the past who were sort of a step beyond the rest of us. They were willing to fill the middle between these two positions with a whole range of possibilities, and then have beings constantly moving back and forth in order to explore and illustrate what all these different valences might be. And core to the medieval revolution against the ancient epoch was the overthrow of the notion that nature is supreme. That was at the very center of the whole thing, because the Christian God was to pre-exist nature and not to be bound by nature in any way, but to instead be the author of nature, and not the author of nature in the way that human beings author artistic works, in which we take existing matter that already has its own lawfulness and we mold it according to its lawfulness to bring forth as much of the form that we envision as we can, because for the Christians, that was too limiting a conception of God. So no, God had to be so far beyond humanity that he created things ex nihilo, out of nothing, with no constraints. He invented the matter and the form and put them together however he felt like. It was infinite will, absolutely unconstrained will. And that capacity to do that was done in order to trump all of the ancient divinities. In the debates that early Christians had with pagans, they wanted to be able to win the arguments by saying, your gods are all inferior to our God. Our God is better than yours. Our God doesn't create in the limited, constricted naturalistic ways that yours do. Our God can do things your gods can't do. He's infinite, so he's above you. And by doing that, they were able to shove down all of the old divinities into the, by saying that they were bound by the realm of nature, they shoved down nature, thus shoving down all those divinities, and said, we postulate a new kind of divinity that is beyond nature. And nature has now been overthrown. Nature is now not the ruler of the cosmos. Our God is. He's infinite and can do all things and knows all things and is all good. And furthermore, in order to win the argument, not only did they then put God above nature, they then evacuated nature of any meaning or significance whatsoever. Right? In the ancient world, nature was the source of all meaning and truth. And the gods only reflected it. They only embodied it in order for us to understand in a mythical way, to understand nature better. And so therefore, all right and wrong and truth came from nature. But in order to complete this revolution that they began, they then sucked all the meaning and the medievals sucked all meaning and truth out of nature and gave it to God and said, everything is evil and sinful and worthless. And if it weren't for God, it should be exterminated immediately. But God is all good. So he endows you with the capacity to be lit like a candle and to have a tiny flame to reflect his massive flame. You get a tiny bonus of meaning. In your nothingness, in your nihilistic abyss of worthlessness, God will grant you this point. You don't deserve it. It's not because you've earned it. You can never earn it. It's only from his infinite goodness and mercy that he chooses to keep you from falling into hell, from being utterly destroyed.
The spark of divinity.
The spark of divinity, yes. And that's why the focus is on grace, right? You don't deserve it. It's given to you as pure grace. But in order to make this theogony work, nature had to become meaningless. Human existence had to become meaningless. All the old divinities had to become meaningless. It created an absolute black and white distinction between the source of all goodness and meaning and everything else, which is worthless, except that, God deigns to give it some some momentary grace, which it could lose, right? If it sins, if it behaves badly and refuses to acknowledge its subordinate position, if its ego grows too large and it begins to believe it might have some enduring intrinsic value of its own, then it deserves to burn for all infinity in hell, right? That's the theogony that was set up. That's the structure of the cosmos that was set up. And that's why it was such an overwhelming revolution against the ancient world, because in the ancient epoch, this schema was inconceivable. It was inexpressible. This was a non-thing. It was outside the frame of possibilities. Even all the creator gods of the ancient epoch all had their lawfulness. They were all bound in various ways. The idea of a purely infinite will and an infinite creativity that could make anything and everything that it chose to, and that it didn't choose to because of its past history, because there was no past history. It was like a big bang, free of all encumbrances, able to do what it wanted. That became the perfect portraits of spirit. Spirit in its infinitized form. Spirit not bound by nature, bound only by its own desires and will. And that picture of spirit is indistinguishable from the modern conception of perfect freedom, i.e. perfect will. That is to say, this is a different model of spirit from the ancient world's model of spirit. It is, in fact, will or ego being substituted for spirit. Because the thing about spirit as it occurs in that middle place in between the divine and the human is that our attempts to seek freedom and to make choices in the world are necessarily always constrained by our history, as Donald points out. Smith talks about the historicism, he talks about the past. How did we get here? What is binding upon us? And it's also, under the ancient model of nature, it's also bound by the restrictions of the lawfulness of nature. There's no such, it's inconceivable for there to be an infinite spirit. Spirit is necessarily, it may be infinitizing, but it's necessarily tied to and constrained by nature itself, which is the ultimate authority. That's spirit. That's what spirit was. And what the medieval revolution said is, no, it isn't. That's not even worth calling spirit. Only perfectly infinite will with no restrictions on it counts as spirit. And thus Verstand, or in other words, noesis in its self-enclosing form of wanting to be itself and only itself, was deified. And it was said that that is the nature of God, that God is like an egocentric human will if it were truly able to cut all its ties with everything and do whatever it wanted, that it wanted for no reason, just because it could. That would be worth worshiping. And that would be the nature of God. This was a huge break. And it was a revolution in the sense that it revolved the relationship of dependencies and ascendancies and priorities. It overturned the natural order of the ancient epoch and replaced it with an order in which at the top was what was called spirit, but what was meant perfectly pure infinite will, which is a very different thing. So when he says that spirit is the defining and central principle of Christianity, there is a paradox in that clause, because it is what what Christianity said is that God is the source of spirit. God has infinite spirit, but just by calling it that kind of spirit, it isn't the spirit the way that the ancients meant it. And so therefore, spirit is simultaneously the defining and central principle of Christianity, and also not at all in any way the defining and central principle of Christianity. This clause is a paradox. And, Kenneth Smith, fan of Heraclitus, he loves his paradoxes. It's very easy to read past this and not see that he's simultaneously saying something very serious and also got his tongue in his cheek at the same time. Phil, and then Peter, then Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually generally agree with what he said about soul and spirit. And I came to it in a sense through music in a way. I remember when I was at Berkeley and there was a great festival where they invited some very, very great blues artists. Uh, they were very old at that time. And I think that soul really is primarily passive, but understands the tragic. Because I connected with their music because it was about, I guess, suffering in the world in a sense, in a very keen sense, but I guess not ground down by it, but suffering in it. And they were very humble because there's one particular guy, Sunhouse, who really moved me because he was actually very quite well known, and I think in the 20s and maybe into the 30s, and suddenly it sort of went away, and he just lived most of his life in obscurity. Was just became a train conductor, and like he just accepted, oh, this is the way things are. That's all there is. And then suddenly there was a kind of revival, and he was on stage again to a certain degree. And I think same thing in terms of music. I think of Wagner as having too much spirit, this expression of the infinite, and not enough about the soul, and is not connected as enough to the soul. And whereas Mahler was connected to the soul, but that expression of the soul through the spirit was a deeper connection. And the further connection I made was really what you've been saying about the relationship between the earth gods or earth goddesses and the sky gods. I've often used that metaphor about the artist, I guess, is expressing his spirit, standing in the city walls, in which nature is the soul, you're connected to it. And in a sense, I guess the civilization was, the understanding, and that you're equivocating between the two because you never let one go and the other, and it really becomes a synthesis. And I kind of think the soul accepted its limitations because living organisms sort of understand that and operate within the possibilities. What I use is the metaphor growing between the cracks in the earth to sprout forward, right? And that limitation, even an acorn eventually reaches limitation up to the full-grown tree, but it doesn't become something else, right? Except maybe through evolution, and slowly it could change that way. And I kind of think the spirit is something that, in a sense, is that transitional force that allows you to, in a sense, move from one stage to another stage to another stage. But it's always bounded, to me, in a sensible way, by the boundaries between the sky gods and the earth gods, the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you think of yourself as suddenly become a sky god, you're wrong. And I guess maybe if you are just like bound to earth too much, then you are sort of like maybe too limited, because the moment that's important is that horizon of possibilities that you could grow and reach into the infinite, but never really, in a sense, possessing the infinite. That's the way I look at it. And I think that, so I think the relationship between the masculine and the feminine also agrees into that. Is how to create that synthesis and understanding between the two, because the feminine force is by and large much more passive, and the masculine is much more forceful and externalizing. And I think the thing is to find the synthesis between the two rather than to say, one or the other. And I just think that the horizon is where it's at in a way, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think
Like the city gate.
yeah, beyond the horizon, it's almost as if you're becoming hubristic.
Yes.
But on the other hand, sinking back to the ground, I said, let's just forget the whole thing, man. He's like, we're not going to get anywhere anyway. Why
That's
not
also
just,
a problem.
why even sprout? I mean, I
Right,
think that's
right,
also a
right.
problem, right?
It's all just
So I
seeds.
kind of think, I think the organic model actually is a good one
Yeah.
because that's what we are. We're an organism that hopes to evolve, both, I think, both in terms of a race, physically, but certainly in terms of a individual, mentally, to evolve conceptually and be connected to the soil, connected to the feminine principle, connected to the limitations, but always wanting to reach beyond that. And that's why I find also Beethoven interesting, is like,
yeah,
that degree of reaching,
yeah.
One of the great paintings is actually by the writer, what's his name? Anyway, of the hand reaching, but it doesn't tell you that it's got it. It's just reaching.
Michelangelo.
No, it was a writer.
Okay.
He's known as a great writer, but I just forgot his name, but
Sure.
he was very, very important. And he, in some of his art, incredible. I mean, when you look at it in terms of like contemporary art, it's like there's some that I could claim it's maybe it could be shown in a gallery in the 1960s or 70s. It's like way ahead of his time, but they were sketches because he was known as a great writer. So anyway, so that was interesting, a discovery that I made that most people don't know about him as a great artist. I mean, a potential artist, but he was a great writer. So
Thanks,
that's
Phil.
what I got to say about the relationship between the soul and the spirit. The
Yeah.
spirit is the driving force that allows you to reach, and the soul is connected to the life of limitations.
Yes. Thank you. Peter, go ahead.
I think this whole it's again dualism, right? About having a definition game of soul versus spirit, masculine versus feminine, earth versus sky, all these different ways of trying to find the definition that you like, and what is the evolution or key towards the how that game of duality has been played out in the Western exoteric, field of study.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so it's still just a game of playing conceptually one versus the other, a very small game of use a Rorschach test of how do you project onto duality. Oh, this is, I feel this word means this word means that, so that helps how they relate to each other. I think therein lies the innate prison of the mind, is where everything, the belief that everything has to boil down to two or one. Right. And I think that therein lies, the why people's minds are so trapped is because they feel they have to boil things down to two. Where I would invite everyone to look at that Wikipedia article of the subtle body in different metaphysical systems throughout the world, where it's not about two, it's about 5, 6, 10, 12. Who the fuck cares? But it's more complex, nuanced ways of trying to divvy up all the great diversity of personal experience that the mind can experience, rather than artificially trying to find a groundwork. Fuck all this complexity. I want to boil things down to the essence. So I'm just going to meditate on this two over and over and over and over again for all eternity, because that's what I find fun. Well, sure, that can be fun. Playing with what's soul versus spirit, what's active versus passive, masculine versus feminine. But I think, it really makes things so that the experiential aspect, the gnosis, gets fundamentally fixated on this very small conceptual framework. I mean, the big question that I have, for this group, and especially for Ken, because, you should, Rick, let me ask you a question. I need to make this point. Have I often been on point in these groups?
Oh, yeah.
I haven't read anything of Ken.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say?
It could say many things. One of them is
says that his
you know,
ideas aren't that phenomenal to me because they're basic. And he is, it's amazing what he's done when it comes down to the sources, but he's obviously incredibly ignorant of Eastern traditions and the occult schools of thought outside of the mainstream. He's done a wonderful job working with mainstream exoteric ideas and trying to find the limitations of them, but still, it never makes the jump. It's still boiling down to spirit versus soul. Who the fuck cares? I mean, it's an endless definition debate again and again and again and again and again about rolling this over, finding the exact ways of how they relate, because I need to find this out. But dude, just look at these other systems that exist, these other models, okay? That the chakras, or of Taoism, all of these different things where you've had scholars for thousands of years reflecting on experiential, not conceptual ways of exploring the mind.
Yes.
Mhm.
And therein lies what I would beg all of you to do, is to experiment with experiential states of consciousness that, without drugs, that you can go into that are not based on this false dichotomy that just keeps on infecting every single movement of mind. And it's just like, dude, if you're having fun, great, but otherwise you're going in circles, dude.
So I can hear that we've touched your third rail. You're incredibly animated right now.
I've been
Here,
trying to really
I just
every single time, and it's just like it's never getting through.
Peter.
No.
I mean, you look upset, but you're really not upset.
I'm
are you?
passionate.
Yeah,
This is
you're
like,
passionate.
But
Yeah.
you're not truly upset about what you're talking about, right?
Right.
Because we don't want you to get that upset about a philosophical thinking and discussion.
I
Right?
can get upset however I want, though.
I know, but we're concerned about your physical health.
Well, I would be
At
more
least I
concerned
am.
if I kept it in or I didn't care about anything. To me, passion,
Yes.
repressed passion, is worse than even having no passion. I
Right.
care. What I say I care about.
Yes.
And I feel that a lot of the dialogues and reflections on Ken of saying, well, this is the problem, so I'm going to then indulge further in the problem by boiling things down to the two again.
Which
you
is
know?
not what he's doing here.
No, not
But-
necessarily.
But we've touched your third rail. So because we've touched your third rail, you now believe he's boiling everything down to two, whether he is or not. Right? Because he's not a dualist. He doesn't believe in dualism.
Well,
In fact, he's
there's what people
critiquing-
say and what people do, right?
He's critiquing 2,000 years of dualism and trying to show its limitations.
Sure. He is able to do that very articulately, and I don't mean to take away from that, but he's not doing that's just to acknowledge the problem does not necessarily mean moving towards a solution.
But if you haven't read any of his works, how do you know he hasn't done experiential Eastern mysticism? How do you know he doesn't have whole books about that?
Because I trust you to represent him.
Oh no, I'm just representing this current essay.
Well, I
Right.
mean, every single thing that you've talked about, and me being on point, regardless of not reading the main text, I don't know what that says to you, but to me, it says that if I'm getting close to the essence of what he's talking about, and all of these different ways of his framework,
Would you
of
like to
what
know
he's
what it
trying to
says
get
to you?
across, right?
I mean, you said that you know what it says to you, but you don't know what it says to me. Would you like to know what it says to me?
Well, sure.
What it says to me is that we have a good discussion group and that we are more or less talking about the subjects that we mean to be talking about. And you recognize these subjects and you understand them. So when you join the discussion and you bring your experience to it, your experience is relevant. The discussion makes sense. it provides a framework for you to come in, even without having read the text, and to be able to make sense too. But it doesn't say anything about the quality or limited quality of the text itself. To know that, you'd have to read the text and then make up your own mind about it. Right? There's multiple interpretations of why you're able to fit in so well. And one of them is you're an observant guy with a lot of experience to bring to bear and a lot of creativity and passion. And that's why the things you're saying are on point. Because otherwise, the alternative is if you're an interesting, educated person with a lot of backgrounds and you join a discussion you haven't been in before and you have something to contribute, what you're arguing is that the fact that you had something contribute proves that it was a worthless discussion and didn't need to be said in the first place.
No.
Whereas
I'm
to
not
me,
trying to
it
make
proves
that
the
argument. I'm
opposite.
not trying to say it's worthless. I'm saying that Ken's points are things that are already well established in 1,000 other writers that I've read. And
Well, they're really not.
I'm sure he wrote it down in a way that was articulate and meaningful in regards to the schools of thought that he was reacting and reflecting with in order to help move beyond. I'm sure it must have been a very Herculean effort in regards to the angle of approach that he took that was utterly unique in order to get to these ideas that were otherwise evident in other traditions. So I don't mean to take away from his accomplishment, but I'm saying that, dude, it's a jumping off point. If you want to go from to the experiential, you got to go to the experiential. And I feel like a lot of this sort of reflections on his ideas, regardless of what he personally does himself, the average interpretation I'm looking at is simply another form of fixating on the same exact problem by as if that of self-awareness in and of itself leads towards transformation. And I would disagree with that. I would disagree. It involves doing something differently.
Kenneth would also disagree.
But I don't see when it comes down to what I have read of him, and Rick, I trust you dramatically in regards to your academic rigor and of objectivism in relationship to representing him, that I feel very confident that I can get a great representation of Ken's ideas through you.
Oh no, only a little bit. Only a little bit. I'm not the voice of Kenneth. I'm really not. I'm not trying
to paint that's how you see yourself, but I feel that there's nothing that you've said that has surprised me about him. There's not that my image of him gets firmer over time the more we talk about him, about who he is and where he's coming from. So I'm therefore feeling like, I'm not saying that he doesn't have his own form of mysticism, and I'm sure he's a wonderful imaginative guy going to meet him, but I feel like his argument is sort of perpetuating the problem, even though he's trying not to.
The problem. There's the problem of dualism.
The problem about these sort of confusing experience with conceptual understanding, right?
It's funny because his entire body of work is about understanding the differences between them.
Yeah, and yet he ends up perpetuates the problem for the reader.
Understanding the differences between them, and also understanding that the third faculty that we have a capacity for as human beings is to bring them together in a way that in the modern world we're discouraged from doing. Right? He's not an advocate of Begriff, and he's not an advocate of Verstand. He's not saying we should be dualic, and he's not saying we should be, Banausic. He's not saying either of those things. He's not advocating dualism.
I'm not saying that he is. I'm just saying that whether or not he's advocating it, he's still propagating it based on his methodology of trying to express it.
Well, that may be how he comes across to you, and there's nothing I can really do about that other than, do my best job to show what I think the fuller picture is. And if it doesn't come across, then that's on me.
Well, I'm saying
I'm gonna call on. There's a long line of people here, so I'm gonna call on them so they can bring different perspectives, and we'll circle back around to this. So Stephen, and then Donald, and then Phil, I think.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm just going to say I had the opposite experience. I looked at Kenneth Smith and I thought, who is this fool? And of course, I started looking at his stuff, and I realised he was raising a lot of questions which have just been ignored by everybody else. And I'm not saying those questions are original; they're there in history, but everybody else has forgotten them, and he's digging them out. So I appreciate his efforts. But anyway, getting back to the question of the dualism between soul and spirit. Now, the grandiose church of the Middle Ages defined the soul as being classically reason.
Mm-hmm.
We have another word that describes another faculty called imagination. Now, I would claim that imagination is something which we could call being of the spirit. So for me, spirit and soul contrasted could be reason and imagination contrasted. We could argue about what is reason, we use it a lot, and then what is imagination exactly?
Right. It's a huge question. Donald and then Phil, and then we'll circle back around.
Well, when Peter started talking, this sounded very much like an impassionate modernist defense against Kenneth. I would point out that I'm not sure. Kenneth, at least here, is not even arguing that there is a God, or he's not even arguing that there is a soul or there is spirit. What he is saying is that in a certain epoch, the concept of soul and spirit appeared in human history and largely screwed us over and helped make modernity a poor place historically to live. And what he's trying to do is help us understand, like, what did they mean by it? How do their ideas work? And how did they result 1,000 years later or 1,200 years later with what we are in? Like, one, he doesn't bring it up here, but the Greeks had a concept of soul.
Right.
And Christianity totally took that word and redefined it. Well, what are the consequences from going from phusis, nomos, from a religion with no dogma to one that's all dogma?
Right.
You know, what is the, you know, so I don't see this as being the same thing that most people talk about. Most people just slide through these changes in concepts, you know, that
without ever noticing.
Without ever noticing. Right. You know, it's like, I was thinking last week when somebody brought up some discussion of the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is a Greek word, but the altar in a Greek temple sits out front. And the Greeks, they weren't dummies. Usually when they sacrificed to their gods, they cut off some crap off the animal that nobody wanted to eat, and they burned it on the altar and offered that as a sacrifice to the god, and then they cooked the meat and they ate the meat. But in a Holocaust, which was a way in which this ceremony proceeded, they burnt the whole animal and the gods got it all. And that was pretty rare, because normally they weren't so foolish as to give good animals to their gods like that. They were more, let's just give them a little fat and some skin and some other stuff. Anyway, I'm not here. I can't speak for Kenneth either. But I know that when I've argued with him, it's usually been I'm not near subtle enough to, to really find a point that, if I think something's gone wrong in his argument, it's usually that something has gone wrong in my thinking. So I do give him perhaps more than Peter the benefit of the doubt, because I've been on the losing end of argument after argument, decade after decade. But I just want you to say, he's not even saying God exists. He is saying that Christianity appeared in history, and we need to understand how it changed the ancient culture into the medieval culture, and what consequences that has for our modern culture. And that's what we're seeing here.
Yes.
For all I know, he was unpersuaded by Kierkegaard and thinks this whole spirit stuff is a crock. But we have to think through it in order to reject it. Otherwise, well, unless we're moderns, then we can just reject it and we don't have to think through it or understand the consequences of our action.
That's right.
But I think that's enough.
So I'll call on Phil in a second, but to reinforce something that Donald said, it is, okay, a little personal background. My dad was a radical atheist. And by radical atheist, I mean, he wasn't just atheist. He really needed to stick it to religious people. He really wanted to argue with them and make them look foolish. And this was the environment I was raised in. But I was raised to be a good boy. So I didn't want to, harass people because I knew harassment was bad. So I always had this tension growing up. The way I was raised, nothing of the supernatural existed was the way I was raised. And then I'm talking about my past self. But that it's not, it's not my place to go tell everybody they're wrong. I was raised to understand that, for example, Martin Luther King Jr.'s enormously valuable contribution to society was highly motivated by his Christianity. And if he hadn't been a Christian, he might not have done any of those things. For him, the nature of God and the Spirit was at the core of why he was willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good. And so I had a different relationship to a religion that I didn't have than my dad did. But still, I was raised to think that it was all nonsense, right? It might be respectable and important nonsense, but it was nonsense. When I first read Kenneth Smith's writings, every time he talked about solar spirit, my eyes glazed over and I skipped past it. And if I had been forced not to do that, if I had been attending these sessions, for example, and somebody else had been running them, and they laboriously forced me to talk about what is soul and what is spirit, I would have reacted very much like Peter just did a few minutes ago. I would have at some point said, for the love of God, can we stop talking about soul and spirit? This stuff is all cliche and it doesn't really mean anything anyway, and there are better ways to look at things and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not attempting to reduce you to who I was as a past self. I'm attempting to say I have an enormous amount of personal, emotional empathy for what you were feeling at that moment. Because I too read I grew up in a traditional martial arts tradition. I was interested in Zen Buddhism. I was interested in Taoism. I was interested in a lot of other things that went well beyond the cosmology and epistemology of Christianity. But over time, not entirely, but partly because of reading Kenneth Smith's work, I came to understand that you can't understand modernism or any modern person or any modern idea, including ourselves, without understanding medievalism. At least for people who come out of the medieval tradition, like moderns do, that's the case. And the reason is that nothing that moderns think that they are is true. Moderns are actually a product of evolution through history, and what they evolved from was medievalism. And it means an enormous amount of what we take for granted as obviously true and not worth discussing is actually an unexamined inheritance of older traditions and older concepts. What we think of as freedom, what we think of as reason, what we think of as society, law versus chaos, the nature of nature itself, the nature of human character, all of these things begin with a medieval imprint. And if we don't know what that imprint is, then we don't understand how modernism has changed it. In what ways is it the same as it was? In what ways is it different from it was? In what ways have we changed the words around, but we might actually still mean the same thing, but from a different perspective? When we say, you know, when the oracle at Delphi tells us, "Gnothe se auton," know thyself, part of what Kenneth Smith's argument is that we have to know ourselves historically. We have to know how we and why we got to the place that we're at, or else we're likely to make assumptions about our identity that are not actually existentially true. They're just placita. They're things we wish were true about ourselves. And so armed with that dawning gradual realization, which by the way did not come easily, but which I fought tooth and nail for a long, long time, I came to understand that I too was a quintessential modern. For all that I thought I was a rebel, for all that I spent all my time reading countercultural stuff and things from other cultures and immersing myself in it, I was still coming at them as a modern, interpreting them as a modern. Even when I rebelled against modernism by interpreting them in a positive way, I interpreted them in the positive way that a modern would interpret them. I was a specific person with a specific set of limitations, trying to dilate his mind, but only doing it in a stereotypical way that was characteristic of the people of my age. And by going through that process, I gradually came to understand that my dad's form of atheism was itself stereotypically modern. It was, how to say this, being recorded, posted on the web and on YouTube. Hi, Dad. So how do I say this? The way to say this is that it is natural for a revolutionary to overthrow and exactly invert what came before, and to say that everything the people I'm rebelling against value must be of zero value, and that the things that they despised must be of infinite value. To just flip everything, because that's the natural thing to do. This is what Hegel warns us of, that we negate the prior conditions, and in so doing, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that is, I had absorbed all that growing up as a child. I just took it in as a naive atheist, child. That's the way I took it in. And so I assumed that it was right. The idea that the sacred could be important and even necessary to human sanity and culture, regardless of whether or not it takes the form that the medievals say it does, was unthinkable to me until Kenneth Smith. The idea that soul and spirit could be important ideas, not in the way that they were meant by countless people that I've argued with over the years, but in some other way that nevertheless remains important, whether I like it or not, was unthinkable to me, which is why I always skim those passages in Kenneth Smith's writing. It's only after about 20 years of wrestling with it and what he meant by it, instead of what I thought he meant, and seeing the larger picture and coming back to the text again with fresh eyes, that I've come to understand he wasn't saying what I thought he was saying. He was saying something else that was a lot more interesting and a lot more important, and that specifically addressed a blind spot in my own self-image and cosmology that was exactly the thing I most needed to overcome, which was exactly why I resisted it the most, because it was my blind spot and I didn't want to go there. It made me upset. Now, I'm not saying any of that is what's happening with you, Peter. I'm just offering a personal anecdote about how I responded when I read passages like this in his text. For example, the book that we're going to do next, Millennia and Microcosm, talks through the ancient epoch, the medieval epoch, and the modern epoch, and what characterizes them. It compares and contrasts them. It shows how, like the bud, blossom, and the fruit, they developed out of each other, not in arbitrary ways, but in the ways they had to, based upon their internal natures, the way that they were. And in doing that, he's going to talk about soul and spirit. I first read that about 20 years ago, in Comics Journal. And when I read it, I skimmed all the stuff about soul and spirit for that very reason I just described to you. I just couldn't focus on that part. I really like the ancient stuff. I really like the modern stuff, but I wouldn't let myself really engage with the medieval stuff because I had such an antipathy to it. But coming back to it later, I've gradually come to understand not only was it just as interesting as the other two parts, but it was necessary to understanding the other two parts. And at the first time through, I only thought I understood the parts about the ancient epoch and the modern epoch. I didn't actually understand them because I was trying to understand them out of context. And that's the core of Kenneth's argument. When we get the full context, the historical context, the lawful, natural context of things, we get a fuller understanding of them. And it changes what they mean to us. And it offers us the possibility of doing new things we couldn't do before. And you might have already gone down this road, and this might not be new ground for you. And it might be some other part of Kenneth Smith's writing that would be more interesting to you. And the process of slowing down and going through this might be excruciating for you because it's like someone going back through addition and subtraction over and over again as though they're new ideas. And you're like, for the love of God, can we get back to calculus? Which is the level at which you want to work. It might be that that's what's going on. I mean, I can't know. But for me, there's an interesting wrestling match, and I think for some of the other folks going on in this text that might not be happening for you. Phil, and then Donald, and then Stephen.
Yeah, I want to make 2 points quickly, and then get to the third point. The first is Victor Hugo as the artist, the writer I mentioned. So he was a great writer, but he was also a great painter.
I didn't know that.
The second was that, when Jenny called you Professor Marshall, I sort of chuckle a bit because he's not authoritarian enough to be the sheriff of anything. Guys, the third point is like, I guess at what point does, being an artist, I'm interested in production. So that's where the virtue lies. But I also understand that at what point does criticism is a production as well as a criticism, right? Because sometimes criticism could just merely be a kind of repetition of the original production.
Sure.
And without much more new creation.
Sure.
At other points, criticism could be production itself by uncovering the hiddenness within the previous thing that is criticizing. So that's the thing I want to say about that. And I kind of think that may be important because history could also be hidden and could be revealed as well before you move on. So I think that may or may not be important. So one way of look at it, it could simply be a repetition that's actually, in a way, rather conservative, holding up the tradition in one way. The other way is that it could actually be a productive and a progressive evolution, thing that's necessary for evolution. So that's all I wanted to say about criticism, is that you have to distinguish what that particular criticism is.
Thank you, Phil.
I just wanted to quickly respond to you, Phil. Are you saying that you don't agree with me in that Rick is my professor? Is that what you just said?
No, I'm just saying the title of professor, which he covers his face, is that he is not at all authoritarian in any way.
But you know what I
find? To be a sheriff, I know I misspelled sheriff. It's a different spelling, but nonetheless, it's similar enough that I sort of chuckle. Because,
well, I'll tell you what, he certainly knows more about any topic that he discusses than I ever do. And not only that, the way he articulates whatever he says makes it so understandable and so clear that I find listening to Rick just always very pleasurable. So
yeah, no, I'm not arguing that point at all. I was just chuckling at the word Professor Marshall. And I just sort of saw that a marshal have to have the almost a authoritarian figure, right?
Okay.
So I do not think that he runs this meeting with that sort of sheriff mentality.
Thank you,
see.
Phil.
Okay, okay.
Okay. Donald and then Stephen.
Well, I think sometimes with Rick, I feel like we're sitting in the cave with the fire behind us, looking at the wall of shadows and saying, well, that looks like something Kenneth said. And that over there might be something that Kenneth pointed out. But
Yes.
Kenneth did once say that modernity is an epic. And he maybe this may come up in our next reading, that didn't create a new religion.
Right.
That we sort of just debase the old one.
Yes.
You know, we didn't really, as we created a new civilization, modernity with its underpinnings, we didn't go to the trouble to make clear our relationship to the divine.
Right.
Normally, we would have, or historically looking back, you would have expected us to do that, but
Right.
we didn't.
Right.
I think that might come up in our next reading.
I think it
Goodness.
might. I think it might. Okay, Stephen, and then I've got something for Peter after that, and then we're close to wrapping up. So, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to go right off subject and make a reference to astral traveling, since Peter's a bit interested in the concept. I had experiences astral traveling when I was roughly about 20 years old. My experiences pretty much was pretty convincing. It was a day waking conscious experience. It wasn't a dream. I repeated it on several occasions. And the interesting aspect, there does seem to be a real astral world or something there. And of course, this is completely out of kilter with anything that science says. No, that's not there. But I've reached a point where I've read up on some material and I realised some of my mistakes with astral travelling about 40 years ago. I might want to get back into it because I've got questions to ask of entities. But for example, I'd have to give up drinking for a prolonged period of time. That'd be troublesome. But my experience of the whole astral thing, Robert Munro's a very interesting one to follow up. It's an absolutely real thing. It's not nonsense. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen.
Stop licking those toads, Stephen.
Tasty, tasty toad. So I think to me, what I see in Kenneth's take on soul and spirit and will is not something I've seen in this form from any other writer ever. I see how he is indebted to Hegel in arranging them into a dialectic. And I see right off the bat how hardly any writers in the history of Western civilization have said that the relationship between soul and ego and spirit is a dialectic. That's, first of all, that rules out almost all writers. The idea that this is a bud, blossom, fruit relationship is, I mean, if there are people who talk about it specifically in that form, I've never read them. Now, contrary to, I mean, I'm glad that I'm Ginny's Professor Marshall, but contrary to the title, there's an enormous amount I haven't read. I am endlessly curious and voracious. I'm interested in everything, but I'm also finite and I just haven't gotten around to most things yet. So there could easily be writers who have already arranged the same dialectic and I haven't seen it before. That could easily be the case. I'm not trying to say that what he's done is unique. I'm just saying it's characteristic of Kenneth Smith. This dialectic is part of what's characteristic of him. Another part of what's characteristic is the idea that that each of these modes is a strange attractor, a gravity well, and that These are not simple continuums. You know, the modern age loves the idea of a continuum. People love to say, oh, I'm not a thinker or a feeler, I'm in between. People like to say that. They like to be on the threshold and not be pinned down. It's part of the desire to be protean. We don't want to be pinned down. We don't like the idea that nature is lawful and that our own character might be lawful, and that there are places that we can easily go and places we cannot easily go, and that we'll generally fall out of if we try to stay there. That's not appealing to us. We find it more appealing to imagine we could be anything we want to be. I'm put in mind of how angry Einstein was when he encountered quantum physics. You know, the idea that an electron would tend to stay in one orbital or another orbital, but really wouldn't want to be between the orbitals. And if it was there, it would quickly shift back into one of the others. He hated that idea. He fought against it for a long time because the idea that there's not an infinite range of freedom, but instead there is this lawful structure to the universe, and that we can understand it better as a structure with conflicts than we can as understanding it as infinite possibilities. That was really unappealing. It's unappealing to the modern mind. And to this day, most people still don't like quantum physics. If they think they like it, what they actually like is the idea that it's all magic, which means they don't really understand quantum physics. The idea that there is a lawfulness that makes some things far more possible and other things far less possible really makes us uncomfortable, especially if we're talking about our own identity and how we see the world. So the idea that soul and will are not just things that we have and can use like tools whenever we feel like it, but are instead infectious tools that change our minds to become more compatible with them and to desire to do them more at the exclusion of the other. That particular quality has been remarked upon in general as a pattern in other places, like the man with the hammer. But there's a far cry between the man with the hammer and specifically saying that Begriff and Verstand specifically are the hammers, and that they have a very specific relationship to each other that draws us into certain kinds of tension and that makes our development as individuals have certain kinds of struggles. And that the struggle is because of the enormous energy we have to get over to move from one to the other. Beyond that, the idea that the two of them can't be reconciled into a happy medium. And also that the Kantian idea of synthesis isn't going to work here. That rather, they have each been turned around into a finitude and have to be unfolded so that they can come together into Vernunft. This is something that, even though it's in Hegel, you hardly ever see anybody quote this part of Hegel. They might drop the word Vernunft, but they don't go into any detail about what it means, because I don't think most of them understand it. Because the ideas, this particular form of dialectical existentialism is so alien to our worldview that even when we're reading someone as clear as Hegel, trying to lay it out page after page after page, we still can't see it. There's no place for it in the modern world. And so it's part of what's interesting about Kenneth Smith is that he drags this stuff out of Hegel via Kierkegaard and Marx and Kafka and Arendt and others, and then applies it to our current events in ways that sort of make it uncomfortably unmistakable that he is not saying something that we are familiar with or comfortable with. He uses the terms we've seen before, but he uses them in ways that we don't normally use them, and he sets them into very specific relationships with each other, suggesting that the mind is structured in a certain way, that character is structured in a certain way, that our cultures are structured in a certain way, and that these things are all interdependent with each other. The ways that he puts it together, I've just never seen. And I could have missed it. I mean, I've seen the predecessors. I've read Hannah Arendt, I've read Kierkegaard, I've read Nietzsche and Kafka, but none of them said what he says. They've said related things. So, maybe next week, if you're game, Peter, I don't know if you're available next week, but if you are, it would be interesting if you could bring some of the other philosophers who've kind of written in this area that you feel like they've covered the ground already. Because it would be interesting to see it. I know there are enormous deficits in my philosophical education, and I would very much like to fill them. So
I suppose one thing, if I may,
Yeah.
One, I will not be available next Monday because I'll be on the train, but
Sure.
the Monday afterward, I'll definitely be able to. And I also want to say that I really highly respect Ken, and I don't want to give an impression otherwise. Just because I'm critiquing him, that doesn't
Of course.
necessarily mean that I don't find all of his effort and what he has to say has to have value. Of course, it's very, and when it comes down to the pioneer that he is in relationship to the Enlightenment school of thought and its evolution, that of his reflection of taking the trains of these great juggernauts of intellectual curiosity, the mostly the 19th and early 20th century, and trying to figure out what are the commonalities and the limitations therein of him taking it yet forward. I have only respect and admiration. I just was wanting to bring for discussion the limitation of his method of approach in relationship to pointing to the experience without it inadvertently pointing back to understanding. That trap.
Yeah.
And so I didn't mean to say beyond that puzzle that he was unable to solve, of which I believe I've read writers that have solved it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we are always interested in more writers. It's one of the things that happens in the course of going through these essays is he's constantly pointing to other people to read. There's no way to immerse yourself in Kenneth Smith and come away with thinking that he believes you should only read Kenneth Smith. In fact, he seems to believe you should spend your entire life reading new people and you'll never get to the end of it. And that's how it is. So, anybody you want to bring into these discussions when you're available would be great. We'll get past the soul spirit stuff. This particular essay, Soul and Spirit and Ego, spends a lot of time on this particular thing, but most of his writing doesn't. Mostly he writes about other things. So we'll get out of it soon and we'll be able to see what else we have to work with. I also agree with you, and Kenneth would too. He's not the end all and be all of philosophy. He hasn't said all the things that need to be said. Most of the important things to be said are still out there. He's really just pushing, the boulder up the next few inches up the hill so that we can then take it and run with it and push it beyond. So, like you, I feel like there are things that I've seen that are very important to me philosophically that I don't find anywhere in Kenneth Smith's work. A lot of it is compatible with and yet not actually included in. His critique of Hannah Arendt was that Hannah Arendt walked right up to some of the most important topics in epistemology and axiology and then just didn't take the next step. And it left him bewildered about why she wouldn't go and talk about the next part. And, if you're having the same experience reading Kenneth, where you say, okay, this was all good, but what about what comes next? I think Kenneth would say, yeah, he's totally down with that reaction to a philosopher to say, let's move on to the next thing. It's important to get to the next bit. That's legit. So I know you got your hand up, Phil, but we're at the top of the hour and we've got to wrap up. I've got to run off to do Kabuto. I had a great time today. I hope you guys did too. Next week, Sharon will be back with us, but we'll lose Peter, and maybe the week after we'll have them both, and that'll be fun.
Oh, and where's Anne or Mary Ann? I haven't seen her.
I don't know. She didn't join this week. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Rick.